Welcome to the Grow Renaissance podcast. Let's nourish the world.
Welcome to this episode of the Grow Renaissance podcast, guys. We are on part 2 with Treefera co-founder Jonathan Horn, and today we are going to add to what Caroline brought to the table on everything that Treefera is doing, why they are doing it, the mission they're doing, and we're going to dive a little bit more into some of the mechanisms that are actually used. So, Jonathan, thanks for being here today. Can you just take a couple minutes? And I think your background is fascinating, and the story of how you got to I don't think Caroline said it in the episode, but she has joked with us at the dinner several times that when you brought this to her, she thought it was going to be a hobby that has now turned into a very full-time mission of life. So tell us a little bit about who you are and how you got here.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Will, and thanks for the opportunity to chat to this audience. I'm really delighted to come. So a little bit of background on me. And actually, it's helpful to understand where I came from originally. So I was born and brought up on a farm. So I'm super interested in all things nature and kind of the impact in the real world. I'm a physicist by kind of training. So I've got a PhD in theoretical fluid dynamics. And kind of in the 90s and early 2000s, through that, I spent a lot of time looking at very early stages of artificial intelligence. So it's been a long-running interest of mine, and the value of it and its capability has always been, I think, fascinating. I spent 20 years in investment banking with Citibank and with JP Morgan. And at JP Morgan particularly, but earlier as well, I was really super interested in risk and control. So what can go wrong and how can we stop it? And then using particularly artificial intelligence and huge data sets to try and get a better understanding of what was going on with assets. When you think about JP Morgan, the kind of part of the business I was in, they had something like $27 trillion worth of assets under kind of management and custody. So it's literally a vast business. So the numbers we're dealing with, the value of those assets, really trying to get an insight into those assets was wildly important. I was also actually at JP Morgan, the kind of the sponsor in London for tree planting. So again, going back kind of full circle to my kind of upbringing, planting trees, doing something about climate, thinking a little bit more about our responsibility, if you like, even more than a responsibility, our kind of commitment to stewardship, I think is super important. So Treefera really came out of my desire and my thinking strategically that this would be a good time to come to bring to bear kind of real world data or real assets on real world data on assets, and really get an understanding of assets that were little understood. So let's bring that down to much more practical kind of things. So our mission at Treefera is to help our clients decarbonize supply chains. So what are supply chains? They're very simple things that everybody understands. It's milk, it's cattle, it's cotton, it's wood, it's natural rubber, it's coffee, it's cocoa, it's all of these things. The growing and production of those things has an impact on nature. It has an impact on forests. It has an impact on biodiversity. And in order to understand, as everybody's now starting to really get to grips with, what is the carbon intensity of those supply chains. So how much carbon ends up being produced in the production of a kilo or whatever, a pound of milk. That's super interesting to people who are consuming the goods that comes from, be that chocolate or whatever it is. It's super important to the people who are producing that stuff. They're now under regulatory and legal pressures to make sure they do something about this. And of course, it's like vitally important for all of us in the stewardship of the planet to make sure that we're doing things that aren't like wrecking this for the next generation. That's our obligation. So now, in that whole journey of supply chain, there's a huge amount of data on the actual supply chain itself. So where do these goods come from? There's a huge amount of information, or starting to be quite a lot of information now, on sources of carbon. So when you transport something, it produces carbon that comes out in CO2 in shipping, whatever it is. but there's less information about the carbon impact of that supply chain on where the stuff actually came from. So that could be carbon held in soil on farms. It can be carbon or methane that's avoided in the release of composted manure. There's lots of places where carbon is either absorbed or you can prevent carbon or methane being released that has an impact on that whole supply chain. So it sounds kind of crazy complex, but that's only because we haven't spent a lot of time in the past thinking about carbon in the supply chain. We've spent most of our time thinking about the cost of goods and where do they come from and how much they cost to transport them. If you think about this just as adding to that a different dimension, which is how much carbon does this cost along the way, then you get a really good kind of insight to it. So that's kind of what we're about and where I came from personally and how I came to this crazy space. It's really from farming, physics, banking, and a lot to do with AI and data.
I love it. When you look at the state of the economy of moving from, okay, how do I minimize the cost of goods sold to maximize profits and efficiency of the supply chain, to now moving into a world where from the revolutions that we've had in the past, you look at the Industrial Revolution, we became very efficient. And we now are maybe at the first time in the state of this world where we have massive global trade. And we have global trade everywhere. We have a lot of quote unquote efficiencies in getting goods from one place to another and produce. But now we're moving into a world, as you say, I think, where how we do that. Not only our ability to do that efficiently, but how we do it and the manner in which we're doing it is becoming important. How do you think we got there? Like how are we making that jump into now caring about, all right, we know we can do it, but how do we do it? And how do you see the big companies in the world that are doing that global trade starting to be aware and care about that process?
Yeah, I think that's super interesting. So if you look at the kind of anything in the economy that's the value of something, so it comes from kind of two sides of looking at the same thing. So measure what matters, and the other way I'd think about this. So measure what matters, and the other way I'd think about this is what gets reported gets action, right? So think it's two sides of the same thing. So in the past, we've mostly concerned ourselves with the quality of, let's say, cocoa or coffee or beef or milk or whatever it is, and the price of it. That's what we've considered. Now, what we're saying, now we all kind of collectively agree that we've got to do something about climate generally. There's too much carbon in the atmosphere. That's going up and up. And if we carry on this way, it's going to be a disaster for everyone. So we have to do collectively something about that. The time for small scale action is over. Big actions are required. So it's now on the responsibility of big business, big enterprise particularly, but also individual citizens to really drive change. And I'm firmly of the belief that once you actually start measuring what matters, people will take action on it anyway. So initially, the kind of first thought is, oh, we don't know, we don't understand it, we can't measure it. Once you can measure it, which is where Treefera comes in terms of these assets, you can measure carbon, you can measure what carbon gets absorbed, you can measure what methane gets avoided, and you can bring that data into your supply chain. So once you can measure it, then I'm a big believer that there'll be a drive and impetus from big business and for others to actually do, take action and make material change. I personally don't believe that change will be negative. I think it'll be positive. I think it'll have a positive impact on the real world. I think it'll have a positive impact on people's local environments and communities. I think it'll generate innovation and economic activity that we're not seeing today. So wherever a solution is needed, someone somewhere is going to pop up with things that they can do, that can be innovated, that can be delivered locally, can be delivered on a massive global scale. There's lots of kind of exciting opportunity that comes from that. So I think of it like any innovation and any kind of, it's like when people first kind of thought about the internet. Initially, it's just a bunch of kind of computer nerds hanging around, moving data between one or two computers. Then it got bigger. Then by the 90s, we had a big group of people saying, I don't think this is going to be a big thing, and others jumping on it. And then now no one thinks about not having use of the internet. we're sat here, whatever we are, 3,000 or 4,000 miles apart, and we're having a conversation on a podcast that's going to get broadcast all on a thing that didn't exist in the 60s. But we don't like go back and think, oh no, this will never take off. I mean, it's impossible to think about the world without it. So I think it's going to be exactly the same with carbon. It'll drive a huge amount of innovation. Step one, measure it, measure what matters. Step two, people will do something about it. And the reason it matters so much, I think, is everybody's now decided this is a huge global problem. It's our obligation to do something about it. And that's part of our stewardship of our place on the planet.
I think I love when you say measure what matters and the innovation that Treefera brings to that, because in the past, even 5 years ago, you had months or years of collecting that data and being able to see this is what's happening, to be able to even measure it, to be aware of, are we affecting change or are we not? Is this worthwhile? Is it not? But Treefera brings that innovation to it. Can you talk a little bit to the audience of the innovation that Treefera has brought to the space in the measuring and the mechanism in which you all do that?
Yeah, perfect. And actually, I find it amazingly exciting when you think about kind of my personal journey as well and what's possible technically. So what are we really doing? What's Treefera doing? It's a massively scalable platform that brings together a multitude of different data sets. There's a whole load of AI-enabled data pipelines and engines that decide what's important. They extract the important features from that data. And then the crucial thing is they bring forward numbers, insights, visualizations that make it really accessible to lots of different people. So anybody, it doesn't matter if you're working on a supply chain or working in a farm, whatever, can understand the numbers that are coming out. That to me is the kind of really important part of it. The bit that I kind of get excited about, and I think is maybe the kind of more nerdy end of it, is we're using satellite data that goes back, in our case, to 1984. So it's a little bit of time travel. That's kind of fun. You're using technology that has been delivered to the world at vast cost and amazing kind of capability. That's now all completely accessible from a company like Treefera. We're using cloud technology and AI technology. I'll give you an example. When I first developed an AI neural network back in the late 90s, we had 30 nodes on that neural network. Average large language models, so your ChatGPTs, Anthropic, Cohere, whatever, average they're now running 500 billion nodes. So that gives you, it's just unimaginable scale. So we've gone from looking out the window and seeing one or two stars to seeing the whole Milky Way. It's nuts, the scale of it. So that's what's driving the kind of innovation. And what Treefera has been able to do is to tap into all of those domains, satellites, cloud, compute, massive kind of progress on artificial intelligence. All of this made possible in the here and now because of the cost dynamics of computing, of satellite imagery and everything else. 10 years ago, this would have been infeasibly expensive, though even technically infeasible to deliver these kind of insights. Now it's entirely possible, and we can bring those insights to kind of just regular people trying to take action in the world.
It's amazing. And give them real data that proves. I think when you look at how people talk about carbon, particularly supply chains, there's a lot of opinions in that space. And the beautiful thing about data is data allows for better opinions that move into facts.
Yes,
And
100%.
the better access that you have to that data as regular people and as a community of producers, of consumers, then we get to actually know and understand what's happening so that we can make the best educated decisions for all of ourselves, whether that's what milk am I going to buy? What beef am I going to buy? Am I going to eat beef? Like all of those things, we're getting faster and faster and more innovative. I love what you were saying earlier. Innovation is going to come. When you jump ahead 3 to 5 years, what's the innovation that may not exist today, maybe something you're working on or something that hasn't come yet, but what excites you for the future?
That's a very good question. So what would be really exciting for me is to make this available in a way that everyone can discover it, they can understand it, and they find it trustworthy. So what I mean by that is it's data that everyone thinks, you know what, that makes total sense. I can completely get behind this. So I'll give you an example. If you think about, now it's somewhere between possible and sort of feasible, whatever. But if you just think about kind of medical practice, so the Curies discovered X-ray. That made its way through to, over whatever, 70 years, through to something that's completely mundane. Everybody just, kids would go along and ask for an X-ray. 70 years ago, no one even knew what that was. So there's a massive load of complexity and cutting edge science of the time, whatever, that's got wrapped up into a very simple black and white and now color 3D image. So you still, of course, need some medical professional to say, yes, this is definitely a problem or not a problem. But any idiot can look at a broken leg and an X-ray and think, yes, that looks like it's a problem. You don't need, I mean, Caroline's done kind of medical training, but I've done zero. But even I would be able to identify a very straightforward broken leg. But if you look at the complexity and the amazingness of the technology that goes into that, it's incredible. So my goal with this whole carbon stuff is for people to be able to, as I say, like scan a piece of meat or scan some kind of milk-based drink with a QR code and get right down to where has this come from? Where's the feed that fed the animals come from? What was the carbon intensity of that stuff? It sounds kind of foreign to our ears now, but soon it'll be just like regular conversation. You'll hear people in the street talking about, oh, go down to such and such a shop. The carbon intensity of their meat is lower. I mean, that may sound fantastical, but if you could get just people, everybody being able to understand that, it's massively empowering. It really helps people have agency in the world. So my dream is more about making this discoverable, understandable and trustworthy, and then people will take the right action from there.
I think so too. It's beautiful. I think we go back to how we started of when you become aware and you know what's happening, behavior change begins. That actually is the first step of behavior changes. You must become aware of what's happening.
Yes. And once you are aware, it becomes uncomfortable not to take action. Yes. You think, right, I know what's happening here. I should really kind of do something about that. And then if you then, step two, become aware and then make those tangible actions straightforward for people, then, then you give them agency. It's the same with personal health. It's the same with any kind of thing. Once you're aware and you know what action to take, it's kind of impossible to resist that.
It is. Okay, I want to go in. You had mentioned around trust and having data that people can trust. We have talked a lot about blockchain. You and I, the audience on this understands what the Grow blockchain is and the value in that. For you, why have you entertained the idea of blockchain in general and moving that into the mission and vision that you have with Treefera?
And that's a really good question. So having spent a long time in investment banking, and we did all sorts of experiments, particularly at Citi, on payments using the blockchain and so on. I think of the blockchain, I think there's obviously a higher purpose to the whole thing. But when I think about blockchain, I really just think about decentralized storage of data. And I think about who's going to access and be able to verify that data. So I think of those things as attributes to it. Now, the kind of common example of all of this is or the common kind of refrain to all of this is actually it's more efficient to keep that data in a centralized place. And from a computing point of view, that's true in many cases. However, what I really like about blockchain, it allows for, in fact, it encourages many different participants. And you don't need to necessarily have these trusted corporate relationships with those participants in order to share data and give people transparency to the whole thing. So I think it's a great leveler. The whole technology is a great leveler. So on the one hand, it sounds kind of straightforward and perhaps not that exciting to kind of decentralize the storage of data. But on the other hand, what does that really allow people to do? It allows lots of people to participate and get transparency. And that, I think, is fundamentally important, and it's a fundamental difference from the way the world operates today, which is mostly through centralized data sources that are behind some kind of corporate environment. So very difficult for people to be able to assess where is this really coming from, what's the actual efficacy of this and what have you. Now, of course, most corporates, the vast majority of corporate organizations are trustworthy, and how they gain that trust is by having long-running transparency around audits and all sorts of other important mechanisms to make sure that they're producing this. But I see this thing, and I think it grows a brilliant example. I think one of your mission statements is around putting the farmer back at the center of food production. Now, having come from a farming background, I think it'd be fair to say that a lot of the major corporates who are in the supply chain and consuming a lot of their produce, they wield a huge amount of power. Sometimes that's perhaps at the detriment of the farmer, or it certainly puts a lot of pressures on farmers. I think putting the farmer back in the center and having data that helps them not regain control, it's not about that, but it's more about being able to participate as a more equal partner in transactions. I think that's incredibly helpful. And I think it'll do wonders, because at the end of the day, most farmers I know are actually stewards of the land they occupy. They think long term, they'd like to operate long term. And if the kind of economic dynamics of their enterprise were such that they could take action long term, they would do. I mean, no farmer goes out to destroy their own kind of land. They go out to maintain it and enhance it. And, the partners that we deal with are absolutely in that space and have been doing it for a long time. So I think the Grow, particularly their mission and vision, really resonates with Treefera's mission and vision, which is to use technology to drive positive change on a very big scale. I think Grow's is very, very similar. And not seeking to have domination and control, but let other people participate actively and gain from it. That also, I think, is going to promote the speed and the scale of the action that's required to deal with the challenges that we're faced from a climate perspective.
I think so as well. It reminds me of the quote, "A rising tide raises all ships." And so the more ships, the more people, the more access we have, it makes more data, which is more awareness, which leads to better decisions as a whole. Last question I have for you today is, we look at the world as a whole and you look at the global supply chain. It's a big thing. And there's this gap, or maybe this bridge between the big corporates and the small homesteader. And sometimes we place them against each other or for each other, or as if they're against each other. And this is kind of to the key of the title of this podcast, of being a renaissance, being something where we all come together and we find ways to work together. Because I think, just as you were just saying, every farmer is a steward of land better than anyone, because if that land fails or is not nourished properly, they have no output, which means they can only not feed the land, but they can't feed their families. The big national corporations, they need good products to sell to the consumer that is becoming more and more aware of what they're eating, how they're eating, and what's going into the process of making that. And so how do you see all of those pieces coming together here and now and in the future to provide the utopian supply chain that we all think about?
So why are these supply chains, or why do they have appearance of being tremendously long? And they have the appearance of being tremendously long because traditionally what's happened is big corporate needs X supply, which is huge, of some commodity, cocoa, milk, whatever it is. They have their tier one suppliers. Those have tier two, tier three, whatever suppliers. And then you get down to some local kind of warehouse or consolidation point where farmers are trading relatively small amounts of their stuff, as an example, their commodities. And so you've got that kind of long supply chain. And that supply chain is mostly opaque. It's very hard to see into that supply chain. So it's very hard to say, this container containing these boxes of coffee that's coming to London, where has all that stuff come from? Now, how people have tried to get transparency into that, for movements that I think are well-intentioned, like fair trade and whatnot, they've said, okay, let's go back through all of our tier one, tier two, blah, blah, blah suppliers and get right back to the producer and make sure that person is being fairly treated and so on and so forth. But that's based on loads of transactional points. What we're trying to do at Treefera is we're trying to add data at a massive scale based on really where did all this stuff come from. So we know what turned up in the container, but when you backtrack all that container, that's cocoa or that milk or whatever, where did that actually come from, geolocated on the Earth's surface, and what impact has the development of that commodity, that product, had where it came from. So what has been the forestation or deforestation? What has been the carbon intensity of that thing? What impact has that had? And this is about us importing data sets and bringing them together as a data fabric. What impact has that had on kind of employment? What data can you get that's also geolocated to that location around child labour and land rights and ownership and all of these things? A lot of this data exists, but it exists in a form that people can't discover it, understand it, and trust it. So what we're really doing is we're developing data sets ourselves around what's really happening on the land and methane and other carbon sources and sinks. And then we're alloying that with other data sets to bring a kind of complete picture. So to shorten that supply chain, what you need is data that's going to help you get like real insight. So there's a phrase that the Germans have, which I've always enjoyed, and I'll probably get it slightly wrong, but you can correct me. The television was always called the long-seeing eye in German. And I've always thought that's an incredibly interesting phrase. So if you think about the wonder of television, and I always go back to these kind of historical examples, because things that we take as completely normal today are, in a sense, magical when you first see them. So TV, what is it? It's a camera somewhere that's creating now a digital signal that gets fired up through fiber optic or satellite or whatever it is. It's downloaded and it's decoded and presented to you on the screen. I mean, that is nuts when you think about how good that is. It's absolutely nuts. So what are we doing now? And so we think of, just like we're operating now, we're thousands of miles apart, but it's like we're in the same room, we're certainly in the same podcast, it's completely interactive, it's an incredible kind of experience. All we're doing is exactly the same with data to zoom down that supply chain. So when people look at, if you're sitting in a big corporate or whatever, a big enterprise, saying, right, where's my stuff come from and what's happening where it's come from? There immediately you kind of collapse that whole long distance, that whole manual set of data and whatever, you collapse that right down so you can see this is where on the Earth's surface it's coming from and this is what's happening in that place. And now we take that completely for granted for TV. We'd be surprised if it wasn't like instantaneous. We think, oh, I wonder why not. It's just doing the same for supply chains through data.
I love it. It's a great explanation. It reminds me of my kids whining about their Netflix buffering. Like, why isn't it going? Why is it buffering? They don't even understand that we used to have to put in DVDs and VHSs that were scratched and didn't work. So,
and then you'd come and somebody recorded over your favorite thing. Oh no, what's happened here? Even the idea of being able to watch a film on demand and not having to go to the cinema at a time that had been scheduled by somebody, even that's a wild thought. So I think this technology is going to just become, it'll go from, so Schopenhauer, the philosopher, has this thing which I always thought was very smart. So things, first of all, are derided and ridiculed. Then they're met with anger and disdain. And then they're accepted almost immediately as self-evidently true. And I think we'll just be somewhere between step 2 and step 3. But soon we'll get to step 3, which is, yes, of course you can look at the carbon intensity, and it's completely obvious that I would be able to look at every little farm that my milk or cocoa or coffee came from. People will just completely think that's just obvious and part of how it's always been.
yes. Well, thank you for being part of the creation of it, because I believe in that. I think it's something that will move the world forward in a very positive way when we have the awareness. I think 100 years ago, we used to know where our food came from because we either bought it from our neighbor or we grew it ourselves. And with all of the beautiful innovation that has come over the last century, there's also become new problems because the distance between even me and you from the food that we ate today, that distance has grown and that supply chain has gotten longer. However, because of where we sit with the technology that you've created and the technology and innovation that continues to come from others within the community and the world, we're shortening it again. And that's what has to happen. We can't go back to the same things that we used to do 100 years ago because not everybody in the world is going to start farming again, right? It's just not going to happen.
No, I mean, people are concentrated to live in cities, which is also better from an environmental point of view when you look at the global population. So exactly as you say, well, that's not going to happen. But we have to shorten that distance. 100% agree with you.
And we're doing it. Is there any, thank you for being here, Jonathan. Is there anything else that you would like to add to the community of the Grow Renaissance and the people that can support and how they can support us moving forward?
So I think you guys are doing a tremendous thing, as you know, through meeting people at Grow, doing our due diligence, meeting the people who are part of the supply chain. I moved from skeptical, never cynical, but always skeptical, to kind of fully on board and ready to go. So I'm a massive believer in this is going to have, it's been founded in the right way with the right principles and the right care and attention. And so I think it'll be very successful. I think it's what I'd say to the Grow community. I always think about this in terms of, because in some sense people find like carbon credits kind of weird and magical, and Grow tokens or whatever weird and magical. But I having come from investment banking, when you start to unpick what really is money, the whole thing soon descends into a lot of concepts that are kind of deeply uncomfortable. So you think, how did we get from exchanging sheep, goats, and whatever produce at the local market to all of this stuff that we now keep on our phone that we're completely happy never to see in real life? That journey was short, by the way. So I think sometimes, as you say, you sort of think, oh, am I just like clutching at straws here? Is this like too magical or weird? No, it's not. Because actually, when you really deeply look into money, this is exactly how it's kind of created. And to your point, Will, if you go back, zoom back 150 years, people's kind of belief in money would be much less kind of solid than ours. They'd be much more believing in credit. My neighbour owes me this, but I know he'll pay me back next harvest, blah, blah, blah. That's how people used to operate. And if anybody's interested in that topic, there's a brilliant book by David Graeber, who was at the LSE, a fascinating character. He wrote a fantastic book called Debt, the First 5,000 Years. And it's all about that concept. How is it that we got to believe in money so much? Before we used to trust our neighbour. Now we're kind of trusting this intermediary, which is money. How did that come about? So it's not weird what's happening in kind of blockchain. It completely makes sense.
Well, and I think it's back to the philosophy that you just shared with us. The same way that knowing everything on the supply chain in a trusted and verifiable, decentralized way is the same place that I think blockchain and cryptocurrency in general is at. We're somewhere between 2 and 3, where we're getting there. Hasn't quite become self-evident, but it's coming. And so I think the beauty is we're sitting here today talking about things that we know are coming, that the world generally wants. You and I have been together and separately in conversations of people describing the futures that we wish for, believing that I think we have the solutions and we're working on them and more innovation will come from it. But it's here.
Completely agree with.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you for being here. Thank you, everyone, for listening to Jonathan, the co-founder of Treefera, in the ways that we are working together to nourish the world and bring the most awareness that we can of everything that's happening, of not only for ourselves, but for the plants, the animals, the soils, the atmospheres, and the world as a whole. So thank you all for listening. Please like, share, and subscribe with anyone that may find this interesting, because the more people that we have within our community that are aware of what we're doing, how they can help and how they can be involved, the faster and more efficiently we grow. So please do that. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Grow Renaissance podcast. Make sure you like, share, and subscribe this episode. Remember, it will take a community of us to do the best in the world and truly nourish not only ourselves, but the planet, the atmosphere, the soil, the plants, and the animals on it. So make sure you spread this message anywhere that you can.